Foreseeability. We typically don't hold people responsible for harm they've done if the harm wasn't foreseeable. If a dinner guest who is allergic to peanuts becomes ill after eating a dish with peanut sauce, we don't hold the host responsible if the guest never informed the host of the allergy. As this example suggests, it may be the foreseeability of the negative consequences of our actions that generates cognitive dissonance. Negative consequences that aren't foreseeable don't threaten a person's self-image as a moral and decent person, so they shouldn't arouse dissonance. Supporting this reasoning are experiments in which participants are induced to write an essay in favor of a position to which they are opposed, for example, that the size of the freshman class at their university should be doubled. If any negative consequences of such an action, the essays will be shown to a university committee charged with deciding whether to implement the policy, are made known to the participants after the fact. There's no dissonance and hence no attitude change in the direction of the essay they wrote. But if the negative consequences were either foreseen, participants knew beforehand that their letters would be shown to the committee, or foreseeable, they knew ahead of time that their letters might be shown to such a committee, the standard dissonance effect was obtained. Self-affirmation and dissonance. If dissonance results from threats to people's sense of themselves as rational, competent, and moral beings, it follows that they can ward off dissonance not only by dealing directly with the specific threat itself, but also indirectly by taking stock of their other qualities and core values. As we learned in Chapter 3, Claude Steele and his colleagues have argued that this sort of self-affirmation is a common way for people to cope with threats to their self-esteem. Sure, I might have violated a friend's confidence, but I'm very empathetic when other people are having difficulties. I know I drive an SUV, but no one attends church services more regularly than I do. By bolstering themselves in one area, people can tolerate a bigger hit in another, affirming the self, warding off dissonance. This pro-environment couple may ward off any dissonance that might get aroused by their choice to drive an SUV by reminding themselves how devoted they are to their church and its good works. Recent research has examined how self-affirmation can assuage the need to reduce dissonance in a situation that will be familiar to many of us. Imagine you're having a conversation with someone, a coworker, friend, family member, and in the course of the conversation, the person makes a prejudicial remark with which you strongly agree. Do you confront the person or let the remark pass? Let's be honest, we often let remarks like these slide because confrontation is uncomfortable and can have interpersonal costs. But for those of us who think it's important to confront prejudice, not doing so arouses dissonance, and we start rationalizing our failure to act. And that's exactly what researchers have shown. People who value confronting prejudice but fail to do so end up evaluating the person making the prejudicial remark more favorably, and even reduce the importance they place on confronting prejudice in the first place. There's good news, though. These researchers also showed that a simple self-affirmation intervention, giving non-confronters a few minutes to make a list of their positive characteristics, eliminated the need to reduce the dissonance arising from their failure to confront. Is dissonance universal? We have discussed cognitive dissonance as if it were a cross-culturally universal phenomenon. Is it? Research on this question has yielded some interesting answers. Using the free choice self-affirmation paradigm, researchers asked all the participants in a study to choose between two objects, CDs in this case, to see if they would exhibit the dissonance effect by rationalizing their decision as the correct one. The researchers, however, first gave some participants self-affirmation in the form of positive feedback on a personality test. The participants were Japanese and Canadian, and the researchers wanted to see if the dissonance effect was the same in people from these two different cultures. The results for the Canadians were similar to those in earlier studies. They showed a substantial dissonance effect in the control condition, finding previously unnoticed attractions in the chosen CD and previously unnoticed flaws in the unchosen one, but no dissonance effect if they had received positive feedback about their personalities. The Japanese participants, in contrast, were unaffected by the self-affirmation manipulation. More striking still, they showed no dissonance effect in either condition, which led the researchers to conclude that dissonance might be a phenomenon unique to Westerners. But using an induced compliance paradigm, researchers in another study persuaded participants to do something they didn't want to do, and found dissonance effects for Japanese participants if they were led to think that other students were observing their behavior. As we have emphasized throughout this book, East Asians, along with many other people in the world, are more attuned than Westerners are to other people and their reactions. If East Asians exhibit dissonance effects in the induced compliance paradigm because they question their actions when others are observing them, then they should also show dissonance effects in the free choice paradigm if they are led to think about other people's possible reactions to their choice. This outcome was demonstrated in a study in which investigators had participants choose between two CDs under one of two circumstances. For some participants, hanging right in front of them at eye level was the poster shown in Figure 7.4, see page 226, allegedly a prop from an unrelated experiment. But in actuality, the researchers wanted to see whether the schematic faces in the poster might prime the concept of social others, thereby prompting the Japanese participants to show a dissonance effect, and that's what happened. In the standard free choice condition, the Japanese showed no evidence of dissonance reduction, but in the poster condition they did. American participants actually showed the same or even slightly less dissonance reduction in the poster condition than in the standard condition. Another research team observed a similar effect of social priming when they had participants choose a CD either for themselves or for a friend. Euro-Canadians, as well as Asian Canadians who only weakly identified themselves as Asians, showed much larger dissonance effects when choosing for themselves than when choosing for a friend. But Asian Canadians who strongly identified themselves as Asians showed much larger dissonance effects when choosing for a friend than when choosing for themselves. Figure 7.4, Culture and Priming. This is the poster used by researchers to prime the idea of social others. The labels were included simply to make the poster look like part of another unrelated experiment. So you can see a lot of eyes and then some happy and sad faces. Looking back, behavior can have a powerful influence on attitudes, largely because people like their attitudes to be consistent with their behavior. Inconsistency between cognitions, values, or actions usually produces cognitive dissonance. We can reduce dissonance by changing our attitudes to be in line with our behavior. Dissonance is more pronounced when the inconsistency implies that the self is deficient in some way. Therefore, when we affirm the self somehow, we are less susceptible to dissonance. Different circumstances arouse dissonance in people of different cultures. Self-perception theory. Like all prominent theories that have been around for a long time, cognitive dissonance theory has faced many theoretical challenges, and there have been numerous critiques. One critique, however, stands out above all others in its impact: Daryl Bem's self-perception theory. The theory began as an alternative account of all of the cognitive dissonance findings, but it has important implications for self-understanding more generally, and it offers novel explanations for many real-life choices and behaviors. Inferring our own attitudes. According to Bem's self-perception theory, people don't always come to know their own attitudes by introspecting about what they think or how they feel about something. Self-perception theory, the theory that people come to know their own attitudes by looking at their behavior and the context in which it occurred and inferring what their attitudes must be. Rather, they often look outward at their behavior and the context in which it occurred and infer what their attitudes must be. Self-perception works just like social perception. People come to understand themselves and their attitudes in the same way that they come to understand others and their attitudes. At first, this idea seems bizarre, as implausible as the old joke about two behavioral psychologists who've just finished having sex. One turns to the other and says, "That was great for you. How was it for me?" The theory feels wrong on a gut level because we're convinced that sometimes we just know how we feel about something, and we don't need to engage in any process of inference to find out. But on closer inspection, self-perception theory makes a lot of sense, in part because Bem concedes that sometimes we can just analyze our thoughts to figure out our attitudes. It's only when our prior attitudes are weak, ambiguous, and uninterpretable, he argues, that the individual is functionally in the same position as an outside observer. How do I know what I think until I hear what I say? Anonymous. This caveat is helpful. Most of us can remember times when we figured out how we felt about something by examining our behavior. I guess I was hungrier than I thought, you might say after downing a second bacon cheeseburger. The key question, then, is whether the inference process that is the focus of self-perception theory applies only to such trivial matters as these, or whether the process operates when we grapple with attitudes of substance, such as working on a political campaign or choosing to buy a particular car. Bem's account of dissonance effects is quite simple. He argues that people aren't troubled by any unpleasant state of arousal like dissonance. They merely engage in a rational inference process. They don't change their attitudes, rather, they infer what their attitudes must be. People value what they have chosen more after having chosen it because they infer that, if I chose this, I must like it. People form tight bonds to groups that have unpleasant initiation rituals because they reason that, if I suffered to get this, I must have felt it was worth it. And people who have little incentive to tell someone a task is interesting come to view the task more favorably because they conclude that there's no other reason I would say this is interesting if it wasn't, so it really must be. In support of this explanation, Bem showed that when observer subjects, participants who only observe a situation versus actually experiencing it for themselves, read descriptions of dissonance experiments and are asked what attitude a participant would have had, the observer subjects replicate the attitudes of the actual participants. They assume, for example, that a person who was paid only $1 to say that working on a boring task was interesting would have more favorable attitudes toward the task than a person paid $20. Bem reasoned that if the observers come up with the same inferences about attitudes as the attitudes reported by the actual participants, there's no reason to assume the participants themselves arrived at their beliefs because they were motivated to reduce dissonance. Reconciling the dissonance and self-perception accounts. As already noted, cognitive dissonance theory states that the inconsistency between behavior and prior attitudes, or values, produces an unpleasant physiological state that motivates people to reduce the inconsistency. If there's no unpleasant psychological arousal, there's no attitude change. Self-perception theory, in contrast, contends that no arousal is involved. People coolly and rationally infer what their attitudes must be in light of their behavior and the context in which it occurred. Therefore, any decisive test to determine which of the two theories is more accurate should focus on whether people experience arousal in the standard dissonance paradigms, for example, the induced compliance paradigm, and in similar everyday situations. Considerable evidence indicates that, as dissonance theory predicts, acting at variance with our true beliefs does indeed generate arousal. Dissonance arousal has been detected with explicit self-report measures, as well as with more implicit measures, such as recordings of the electromyographic (EMG) activity of facial muscles associated with arousal. And there's evidence that efforts to dispel such arousal and restore consistency motivates the types of attitude change found in dissonance experiments. It thus appears that dissonance theory is the proper account of the phenomena observed in these experiments and their real-world counterparts, not self-perception theory. But self-perception theory, and the studies Bem offered in support of his theory, capture some important aspects of how the mind works. In fact, a consensus has emerged among social psychologists that dissonance reduction processes and self-perception processes both occur, and both of them influence people's attitudes and broader views of themselves. Dissonance reduction processes are activated when behavior is inconsistent with pre-existing attitudes that are clear-cut and of some importance. Self-perception processes, in contrast, are invoked when behavior conflicts with attitudes that are relatively vague or of less import. Clear-cut versus vague attitudes. Dissonance reduction processes are more likely to be activated when people engage in behavior that is inconsistent with a clear-cut attitude, such as the one many people have about the long-standing issue of gun control, whereas self-perception processes are more apt to come into play for more vaguely held attitudes, such as the one people may have about relatively new things, such as selfie sticks. This consensus view might make it seem as if self-perception processes are relegated to the trivial fringe of social life. They aren't. Substantial research has made it clear that a surprising proportion of our attitudes are rather weak and ambiguous. Although self-perception processes typically influence unimportant attitudes more than important ones, at times they do influence important attitudes and important subsequent behavior. For example, studies have shown that we exhibit the self-perception process, inferring our own attitudes by observing our behavior, when it comes to such important areas as whether we're likely to contribute to the public good, whether we're likely to cheat to reach a goal, our judgments of the precise emotion we're feeling and how strongly we feel it, our assessments of our own personality traits, and whether we truly enjoy an activity we have engaged in our entire life. In addition, the crux of self-perception theory, that we use whatever cues we have available to us to figure out what we think and how we feel, including knowledge of the surrounding context and how we've acted, fits with the tremendous amount of recent evidence that our thoughts and feelings are affected by, even grounded in, our physical states and bodily movements. This area of inquiry on embodied cognition and emotion is currently being pursued in many areas of psychology. The embodied nature of cognition and emotion. A variety of physical actions are associated with different psychological states. When we're happy, we tend to smile. If we don't like something, we're inclined to push it away. And if we agree with something, we nod our head up and down. This is the behavioral component of attitudes discussed earlier. The motor actions of smiling, pushing, and nodding are important parts of our attitudes. As a result, if we're induced to make the bodily movements associated with certain attitudes, beliefs, or emotions, we might come to have or find it easier to have those very attitudes, beliefs, or emotions. In other words, in figuring out what we think, feel, or believe, we draw on whatever cues are available to us, including what our body is doing, without being consciously aware that we are doing so. In one early demonstration of this effect, Gary Wells and Richard Petty, 1980, had students ostensibly test a set of headphones by moving their heads up and down or side to side while listening to radio editorials. When later asked about the viewpoints advocated in the editorials, the students indicated that they agreed with them more if they'd listened to them while nodding their heads up and down than if they'd listened while shaking their heads from side to side. Other researchers have explored the implications of our tendency to push away things we find aversive and pull toward us things we find appealing. Because extending the arm is closely associated with negative stimuli, things we want to push away, and flexing the arm is associated with positive stimuli, things we want to pull toward us, being induced to make these bodily movements can have predictable effects on attitudes. In one study, John Cacioppo, Joseph Priester, and Gary Bernstein, 1993, showed college students a series of 24 Chinese ideographs while they were either pressing down on a table, arm extension, or lifting up on a table from underneath, arm flexion. Embodied cognition and emotion. This runner's pride at winning the race is easily discerned from his outstretched arms, a physical embodiment of pride seen across cultures. The students evaluated the ideographs presented while they flexed their arms more favorably than those presented while they extended their arms. Effects like these challenge the idea, as self-perception theory does, that our attitudes, knowledge, and beliefs are stored as abstract propositions or representations in the brain. They support an alternative view that our attitudes and beliefs, and even the most abstract concepts, are partly embodied in the physical movements associated with those attitudes, beliefs, or concepts. Part of the attitude of disapproval, or the belief that we don't like something, is represented in the physical act of pushing away. Even our understanding of sentences like, "He raced down the corridor," is grounded in the physical act of running. When people read such a sentence, motor regions associated with running become ever so slightly activated, and when they read, "Raymond picked up the Easter egg," brain areas involved in grasping become activated. This explains why people who have had Botox injections, which smooth out wrinkles in the face by immobilizing facial muscles, have a harder time processing sentences containing emotion. Without being able themselves to mimic the emotional expressions they are reading, the very concepts of sad, angry, and so on are a bit harder to access and comprehend. Box 7.4, focus on education, the over-justification effect, and superfluous rewards. If you dropped in on a family dinner in a foreign country and heard a parent tell a child she had to eat her pfannst before she could eat her pfefferwurst, you'd immediately conclude that the younger didn't like peft but loved pfefferwurst. Things people do only to get something else are typically things they don't particularly like. But what happens if the child actually likes pfannst? Because the parents are making her eat pfannst in order to have the privilege of eating pfefferwurst, she might decide maybe pfannst isn't so great after all. Self-perception theory makes just such a prediction, and this tendency to devalue those activities we perform, even if they are pleasing, in order to get something else, is known as the over-justification effect. The initial justification for performing the pleasing activity, eating pfannst, is evident. We would do it because it's inherently rewarding. This is the intrinsic reason we do it. But we also do it because there's an external payoff, eating pfefferwurst. This is the extrinsic reason. Because the extrinsic reason would be sufficient to produce the behavior, we might discount the intrinsic reason and conclude that we don't much like the activity for its own sake. Particularly intriguing evidence for the over-justification effect comes from a study of children's choices of activities in school. Investigators showed 2 attractive drawing activities to elementary school children. In one condition, the researchers told the children they could first do one drawing activity and then the other. In a second condition, they were told they must do one activity in order to do the other. In both conditions, the experimenters counterbalanced which activity came first. For several days after this initial drawing session, the experimenters put out both drawing activities during the school's free play period and covertly observed how long the children played with each activity. Those who earlier had simply drawn first with one and then the other played with both activities equally often, but those who earlier had used one in order to use the other tended to avoid the former. Their intrinsic interest in the first drawing actively had been undermined. The over-justification effect has important implications for how rewards should be used in education and raising children. It's common practice, for example, to reward children for reading books, getting good grades, or practicing the piano. That's fine if the child wouldn't otherwise read, study, or practice, but if the child has some interest in these activities to begin with, the rewards might put that interest in jeopardy. In one powerful demonstration of this danger, researchers introduced a set of novel math games into the free play portion of an elementary school curriculum. As figure 7.5 shows, the children initially found the games interesting, as indicated by the amount of time they played with them at the outset of the experiment, baseline phase. Then, for several days afterward, the investigators instituted a token economy program whereby the children could earn points redeemable for prizes by playing with the math games. The more they played, the more points they earned. The token economy program was effective in increasing how much the children played the games, green bar in the treatment phase. But what happened when the token economy program was terminated and the children no longer earned points for playing the games? Would they still play with them as much? As the blue bar indicates, they did not. Having once received rewards for these activities, the children came to see the math games as something to do only to get a reward, and their original interest was diminished. Such findings don't imply that giving out rewards is always a bad thing. People aren't always intrinsically motivated, and when they aren't, rewards are often the best way to get them to do something they would not otherwise do. Rewards can also be administered in ways that minimize their negative impact. For instance, rewards can be performance contingent or based on how well someone performs. These have been shown to be less likely to decrease interest in an activity than task contingent rewards, which are simply based on doing a task or not. Figure 7.5. The effects of superfluous rewards. This graph shows the amount of time elementary school children spent playing math games originally, baseline phase, when they received rewards for playing them, treatment phase, and afterward, withdrawal phase. So you can see the baseline phase, they spend 20 minutes playing math games on their own. In the treatment phase, they spend 25 minutes playing math games. And then after the treatment phase, when there was no reward for playing the math games, they spent less than 15 minutes playing math games, whereas originally they had spent 20 minutes. The seemingly abstract cognitive act of comprehension isn't always abstract. To understand something, whether an abstract proposition, a sentence of text, or a possible future state of the world, like cars being self-driven, people must mentally try it on or simulate it. And what our body is doing or how it's feeling can facilitate or impede the act of simulation, influencing what we think and feel. Consider the finding that people believe more in the reality of global warming and see it as a more serious threat on hotter days than on cooler days. In one study, participants were inside a laboratory where the thermostat was set to either 81 or 73 degrees Fahrenheit. Respondents in the warmer room expressed greater belief in global warming. The effect was strong enough that conservatives in a warm room expressed the same concern about the problem as liberals in a cold room. In other words, the effect of the temperature of the room was comparable in magnitude to the effect of political attitudes. It seems, then, that to get a handle on the idea of global warming, we must mentally simulate it, and we do so much more easily when we feel warm. Looking back, in contrast to cognitive dissonance theory, self-perception theory maintains that people infer their attitudes from their behavior. Experimental evidence, however, has shown that people do experience dissonance arousal, and it often motivates attitude change. Nevertheless, researchers have reconciled these two theories by showing that dissonance theory best explains attitude change for pre-existing clear-cut attitudes, whereas self-perception theory can best explain attitude change for less clear-cut attitudes. Recent research on embedded cognition indicates that people draw on all sources of information, not just the actions they have performed, but also the precise movements of the body to comprehend ideas and determine their attitudes, beyond cognitive consistency to broader rationalization. The core of dissonance theory is the idea that people find cognitive inconsistency uncomfortable and therefore try to find ways to relieve the discomfort. Other kinds of tension, of course, can also produce uneasiness, and social psychologists have advanced theories about how we respond to these other sources of discomfort. One deals with the uneasiness that arises when thinking about the problems associated with the broader socio-political system to which we are committed. Another deals with the extreme anxiety, indeed the terror, that can accompany thinking about the inevitability of death. System justification theory. Chapter 3 discusses our need to think well of ourselves and what some have called ego justification motives. Chapter 11 discusses our need to think well of the groups to which we belong, or group justification motives. But beyond the desire to think highly of our own talents or take pride in being, say, a Christian, a Canadian, or a conservative, we want to think highly of the larger socio-political system we are part of. We want to see it as fair, just, and desirable. Social psychologists who have studied these tendencies recognize that social and political systems don't serve everyone's needs equally. Those who benefit the most from a given system, such as the wealthier and more powerful people in society, have both a psychological motive and an economic incentive to defend the system. People who don't benefit from the system, or are even disadvantaged by it, obviously don't have an economic incentive to defend the system, but they do have a psychological incentive to do so. According to system justification theory, believing that the world is or should be fair, combined with abundant evidence of inequality, can generate a fair amount of ideological dissonance. Extolling the virtues of the prevailing system is typically an easier way of reducing that dissonance than bringing about effective change. Protest is hard, justification is easy. Common observations that seem to support system justification theory are the fact that many women report that they deserve lower pay than men doing the same work, and the fact that lower income groups in the United States don't necessarily support more egalitarian economic policies over the status quo. Some of the most interesting support for the system justification perspective comes from studies that look at compensatory stereotypes, or beliefs that those who occupy less privileged roles in a society nonetheless derive a number of compensatory benefits. Low-income people may be poor, but they're happier than the wealthy. Women may not have much power, but they're nicer, warmer, and more socially connected than men. These stereotypes give ideological support to the status quo, making people feel more accepting of current gender roles and more accepting of the broader socio-cultural status quo. System justification. To defend the prevailing socio-political system to which they belong, economically disadvantaged people often defend their own disadvantage. For example, sometimes women, such as the nurse shown here, report feeling they deserve to make less money than their male counterparts doing the same work. System justification theory. The theory that people are motivated to see the existing socio-political system as desirable, fair, and legitimate. Terror management theory. Humans may be the only organisms who know with certainty that they will die. For many people, thinking about the inevitability of their own death, really pondering it and letting it sink in, brings on a level of anxiety that verges on debilitating. Terror management theory, TMT, specifies what people do to deal with the potentially crippling anxiety associated with the knowledge of death in order to get on with their life. The most common approach is denial, to maintain that it's only the physical body and this particular earthly existence that will come to an end. Many people, all around the world, believe they will go on living in some other form after life on earth is over. But beyond this common form of what has been called the denial of death, people can derive some solace from believing that although they personally will cease to exist, many of the things they value will live on. For many, this sort of indirect immortality is achieved by thinking about their parental role. They won't live on, but their children and grandchildren will. This viewpoint may explain why men who are reminded of the inevitability of their own death express an interest in having more children. Terror management theory, TMT. The theory that people deal with the potentially crippling anxiety associated with the knowledge of the inevitability of death by striving for symbolic immortality through preserving valued cultural worldviews and believing they have lived up to the culture's standards. TMT further emphasizes that people try to achieve symbolic immortality by thinking of themselves as connected to a broader culture, worldview, and set of values. We will certainly die at some point, but many of the things we value most, our country, freedom and democracy, Christianity, Judaism, Buddhism, or Islam, or even our alma mater or favorite sports team, will live on long after we ourselves do. To the extent that people are closely connected to such institutions, they symbolically live on along with them. Indeed, people tend to vigorously embrace their broader worldview and cultural institutions when reminded of their own inevitable death. But to live on, even symbolically, with a broader cultural institution, we must be a member in good standing with the institution, or at least think we are. It's only when we feel good about who we are that we can feel meaningfully connected to the institutions and worldviews we care about, and thus feel a sense of symbolic immortality. Terror management theory therefore maintains that we should be especially concerned with striving to achieve and maintain high self-esteem when our morality is brought to mind or made salient. Terror management theorists have tested their ideas by subjecting participants to manipulations intended to make their mortality salient. The most common manipulation is to have participants write out responses to two directives. Briefly describe the emotions that the thought of your own death arouses in you. Jot down, as specifically as you can, what you think will happen to you as you physically die. In other studies, participants have been asked to fill out surveys in front of a funeral home, a location associated with death, or they've been shown pictures of fatal car accidents. The future's uncertain and the end is always near. The Doors' Roadhouse Blues. Consistent with the tenets of TMT, mortality salience manipulations have been shown to make people more hostile to those who criticize their country, more committed to their in-groups, and more hostile to out-groups, more eager to punish those who challenge prevailing laws and establish procedures, and more reluctant to use cultural artifacts, such as a crucifix, or the U.S. flag for a mundane utilitarian purpose. Making death salient, in other words, makes people want to uphold the values of the institutions they identify with, and that will live on after them. Mortality, salience, and nationalism. This outpouring of nationalist sentiment during this multi-denominational prayer service at Yankee Stadium following the 9/11 attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon may have been partly fueled by the very salient reminder of our own mortality the attacks provided. It isn't hard to think of potential political implications of terror management concerns. For example, in the run-up to the 2004 U.S. presidential election, survey respondents gave their opinions about either the Democratic challenger, John Kerry, or the incumbent Republican, George W. Bush. Some participants responded after their mortality was made salient, and others did so after writing about their experience with dental pain. Because Bush, as the incumbent president, was the head of the country and was seen by many as the leader of the fight against Al-Qaeda and other terrorist organizations, the investigators predicted that survey respondents would be more favorable to Bush and less favorable to Kerry after a mortality salience manipulation. As figure 7.6 indicates, this prediction was confirmed. There's also support for TMT's contention that mortality salience increases striving for self-esteem. In one study, participants in one condition read an essay stating that the scientific consensus on reports of near-death experiences, such as feelings of leaving or looking down at one's body, is that such sensations are expected given the makeup of the brain, and they don't suggest in any way the existence of life after death. Participants in another condition read an essay arguing that such reports point to the plausibility of some sort of life after death. Next, all participants received favorable feedback about themselves from unreliable sources, such as horoscopes, and then rated the source's validity. Those who read the essay that cast doubt on life after death rated the feedback as more valid than those who read the essay that encouraged belief in an afterlife. In other words, if we can believe there is life after death, we needn't be so concerned with living on symbolically, so the need for self-esteem is reduced. Figure 7.6. Mortality salience and support for candidates in the 2004 U.S. presidential election. Survey respondents reported their attitude towards president candidates John Kerry and George W. Bush either under normal survey conditions or after a mortality salience manipulation. So in the control for John Kerry, a lot of people supported him, but less people supported him after mortality salience by a fifth. And then in the control, less people supported George W. Bush than George Kerry in any condition, but after mortality salience, people supported George W. Bush as much as people supported John Kerry in the control condition. Looking back, the tendency to rationalize goes beyond our attempts to resolve personal cognitive inconsistencies. We are motivated to see the broader socio-political system in which we live as fair and just and good. We're also motivated to deal with the anxiety that comes from being reminded of our own mortality, and we often do so by adhering more closely to our worldviews and finding ways to boost our self-esteem.